The saloon doors swung open with a violence that silenced every conversation, every clink of glass, every shuffle of cards. Margaret Maggie Caldwell stood in the doorway, her black morning dress stark against the amber light spilling from oil lamps. In her right hand, she gripped her dead husband's Colt .45, its barrel catching the flickering flames like a promise of reckoning. Her voice cut through the stunned silence, like a blade through silk. "Which of you cowards killed my love?" 23 men sat frozen at tables scattered throughout the Silver Dollar Saloon, their faces a mixture of shock, guilt, and fear. Someone in this room had murdered Thomas Caldwell 3 nights ago, and Maggie intended to find out who. But the story of how a schoolteacher's wife came to stand armed in a den of outlaws begins 6 months earlier. In the farming town of Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory, where love and violence would collide in ways that would transform not just one woman's life, but an entire community's understanding of justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Falls existed as a contradiction nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. On one side of the valley, honest farmers worked soil that yielded enough corn and wheat to feed families and fill modest bank accounts. On the other side, the Silver Creek mine disgorged enough silver to attract every variety of fortune seeker, claim jumper, and outlaw that the frontier could produce. The town itself straddled this divide uneasily. Main Street featured respectable establishments: Patterson's General Store, the Cedar Falls Bank, and the one-room schoolhouse where Thomas Caldwell taught children to read and cipher. But as the sun set behind the mountains, the same street transformed into something altogether different. The Silver Dollar Saloon opened its doors to miners flush with silver dust and men whose wealth came from less legitimate sources. Margaret Elizabeth Hammond had arrived in Cedar Falls on a Tuesday morning in April 1882, stepping off the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad car with nothing but a carpet bag, a teaching certificate from the Colorado Normal School, and a determination to build a life worthy of the education her late parents had sacrificed to provide. She was 24 years old, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire and green eyes that missed nothing. Her education set her apart in a town where most women had learned their letters at kitchen tables, if they had learned them at all. But it was her combination of intelligence and compassion that made her indispensable to Cedar Falls. Within a matter of weeks, thought the town desperately needed a second teacher. Thomas Caldwell, who had run the school single-handedly for 3 years, was overwhelmed by the growing number of children whose families had followed the silver boom westward. Margaret's arrival allowed them to divide the students by age, with Thomas teaching the older children advanced mathematics and literature while Margaret focused on the younger ones learning their first letters and numbers. Their partnership began professionally but grew into something deeper, with the natural inevitability of two minds that found perfect complement in each other. Thomas possessed the broad learning of a man who had read everything he could acquire in a territory where books were precious commodities. Margaret brought fresh pedagogical methods learned at normal school, along with an understanding of child development that transformed their one-room schoolhouse into something approaching a real academy. Thomas was 31, tall and lean from years of frontier life, but with the gentle hands of someone who had never struck another human being. In anger, his brown hair carried premature streaks of gray, evidence of the responsibility he felt for shaping young minds in a place where education competed daily with the immediate demands of survival. He had come west after graduating from a small college in Ohio, driven by a belief that education could civilize the frontier more effectively than law enforcement or military intervention. The idealism that brought him to Colorado remained intact despite 3 years of watching promising students abandon their studies for the immediate rewards of mining or ranching. Margaret found in Thomas a man whose values matched her own commitment to knowledge and service. Their courtship unfolded through shared lesson planning and evening discussions about educational philosophy that gradually became conversations about everything literature, politics, dreams for their students' futures, and eventually, their own hopes for a life together. The town watched their romance develop with the fond approval that small communities reserve for couples who seem destined for each other. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store with her husband, declared that those two teachers are as well matched as a pair of bookends. Even the most hardened miners spoke respectfully of the schoolmarm and her professor, recognizing that their children's futures depended on the dedication these two brought to their work. Thomas proposed on a warm evening in late September, as they sat grading papers by lamplight in the schoolhouse. His proposal was as thoughtful and gentle as everything else about him. "Margaret, I believe we could build something beautiful together, both in our work and in our lives. Would you consider becoming my wife?" Her acceptance came without hesitation. She had found in Thomas not just a romantic partner, but an intellectual companion and fellow idealist, who shared her vision of using education to improve the world around them. They married on October 15, 1882, in a ceremony that brought together the entire respectable portion of Cedar Falls. The wedding took place in the schoolhouse, decorated with autumn leaves and wildflowers gathered by their students. Judge Harrison performed the ceremony, and even some of the miners cleaned up enough to attend, standing respectfully in the back while vows were exchanged. Their marriage proved as harmonious as their courtship had promised. They moved into a small house behind the schoolhouse, close enough to their work that they could extend classroom hours when needed and far enough from Main Street to avoid the noise and occasional violence that erupted from the Saloon district after dark. Margaret discovered that marriage to Thomas brought not just personal happiness, but professional fulfillment beyond anything she had imagined. Together, they developed innovative teaching methods that accommodated the diverse backgrounds of their students' children, of farmers who needed practical mathematics alongside literature, children of miners who required education that could lift them beyond their parents' dangerous and uncertain occupation. Their most ambitious project was the Cedar Falls Academy, a plan to expand their one-room schoolhouse into a proper institution that could provide secondary education rivaling anything available in Denver. Thomas had drafted architectural plans for additional classrooms, a library, and even a small laboratory for scientific instruction. Margaret had written to educational suppliers about textbooks and equipment that would transform their frontier school into something that could prepare students for university education. The project required funding beyond what the town could provide through normal taxation, but Thomas had identified potential sources of support. The territorial government offered grants for educational development, and several mining companies had expressed interest in supporting schools that could train the skilled workers their operations required. Everything seemed possible in those early months of marriage. Their love provided emotional foundation for ambitions that extended far beyond personal happiness. They were building not just a life together, but a legacy that would benefit generations of children in Cedar Falls and surrounding communities. Margaret taught during the day and spent evenings helping Thomas plan curriculum for older students, prepare materials for his advanced mathematics classes, and correspond with educational institutions about best practices for frontier schools. Their house became an extension of the classroom, filled with books, maps, and scientific instruments that Thomas had collected over his years in Colorado. But their domestic happiness existed in a town where violence always lurked beneath the surface of civilization. The prosperity brought by silver mining had attracted not just honest fortune seekers, but also men who viewed other people's success as opportunity for easy wealth. The division between Cedar Falls' respectable community and its criminal element had grown more pronounced as the town prospered. Farmers and legitimate businessmen pushed for law enforcement that would protect their investments and families. The other element resisted any authority that might interfere with their activities. Thomas and Margaret found themselves inadvertently positioned between these factions. As teachers, they served both communities, educating the children of farmers and merchants while also teaching the sons and daughters of miners, and even some men whose occupations were questionable. Their influence extended beyond the classroom. Thomas served on the town council, advocating for improved municipal services and law enforcement. Margaret organized community events that brought different elements of Cedar Falls together, fostering relationships that transcended the economic and social divisions that threatened to split the town apart. But their very success in building bridges between communities also made them visible targets for those who profited from division and chaos. An educated, unified community would inevitably demand law enforcement and civic order that would interfere with criminal activities. Margaret sensed the growing tension, but attributed it to the natural growing pains of a frontier town evolving toward civilization. Thomas understood the danger more clearly, but believed that education and civic engagement could overcome the forces that threatened their community. Neither fully grasped how deeply their work challenged interests that would kill to protect their advantages. The first direct threat came in late February, when Thomas discovered that someone had broken into the schoolhouse and destroyed materials he had prepared for a presentation to the Territorial Education Board. Maps had been torn, documents scattered, and his carefully maintained gradebooks damaged beyond repair. Probably just kids causing mischief, Sheriff Morrison suggested when Thomas reported the vandalism. But Margaret noticed that the destruction had been too systematic for random mischief. Someone had specifically targeted materials related to their academy project and Thomas's civic activities. The second incident occurred a week later, when Margaret found a note slipped under their door. Teachers who mind their own business live longer than those who meddle in affairs that don't concern them. Thomas wanted to report the threat to Sheriff Morrison, but Margaret argued against it. Morrison's sympathies lay with the Saloon district, and his definition of law enforcement focused more on preventing disturbances that might interfere with mining operations and protecting citizens from intimidation. Instead, they decided to be more careful about their activities while continuing their work. The academy project moved forward, but with less publicity. Thomas's civic involvement continued, but with greater attention to potential consequences. Margaret began carrying a small derringer in her purse, a precaution that felt both necessary and alien to someone who had never imagined needing protection. From the community she served, they were learning that idealism, however noble, required practical defenses when confronted by those who viewed education and civic improvement as threats to be eliminated. The lesson would prove more crucial than either could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Spring arrived early in Cedar Falls, bringing with it a boom that transformed the quiet farming town into something Margaret barely recognized. The Silver Creek mine had struck a new vein that yielded ore so rich it drew prospectors from as far away as California and Nevada. Almost overnight, the population doubled, then tripled. As fortune seekers poured into the valley, with them came a different breed of trouble. Margaret stood at the schoolhouse window watching wagons lumber down Main Street, loaded with men whose eyes held the desperate hunger of those who had chased gold rushes across half the continent without ever striking it rich. These weren't the steady miners who had worked Silver Creek for years, men with families and permanent stakes in the community. These were drifters, gamblers, and worse, drawn by stories of easy wealth. "We'll need to expand the school again," Thomas said, joining her at the window. In his hands, he held a list of new families requesting enrollment for their children. 15 more students this week alone. Margaret took the list, scanning names that reflected the diversity of their rapidly changing community. The Kowalski family from Pennsylvania. The Chun family, Chinese immigrants who had followed railroad construction west. The O'Brien clan. From Boston, led by a patriarch who claimed experience in large-scale mining operations. Some of these children don't speak English, Margaret observed. And look at these ages, we have 12-year-olds who've never been inside a schoolhouse. The challenge excited her. Education had always been about meeting students where they were and lifting them higher. But Thomas's expression showed concern that went beyond pedagogical complexity. "It's not just the children," he said quietly. "Some of these new families are running from things, debts, the law, troubles they hope distance will solve." Margaret understood his worry. Cedar Falls had maintained its balance through the understood boundaries between its respectable and disreputable elements. The miners drank and gambled at the Silver Dollar, but they kept their conflicts contained. The farmers and merchants conducted business during daylight hours and stayed clear of the Saloon district after dark. But the new arrivals had no investment in preserving that balance. They brought conflicts and loyalties from elsewhere, along with a willingness to use violence to solve problems that patience and negotiation might resolve. The first serious incident occurred on a Saturday evening in late March. Margaret was working late at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for Monday, when gunshots erupted from the direction of Main Street. The sharp cracks echoed off the mountains, followed by shouting and the sound of breaking glass. Thomas burst through the schoolhouse door moments later, his face pale with urgency. "Stay here," he commanded. "Lock the door behind me." But Margaret had no intention of hiding while violence erupted in their community. She followed Thomas toward Main Street, staying close enough to see what was happening while remaining far enough away to avoid immediate danger. The Silver Dollar Saloon had exploded into chaos. Tables overturned, chairs broken, and blood staining the sawdust-covered floor. Sheriff Morrison stood in the doorway, his hand resting uncertainly on his gun while he surveyed damage that included 2 wounded men and a third who wasn't moving at all. "What started it?" Thomas asked Dr. Wheeler, who was kneeling beside one of the wounded men. "Argument over a card game," Wheeler replied without looking up. "But it wasn't really about cards. It was about territory. The new crowd is pushing against the old crowd, and neither side wants to give ground." Margaret recognized the dead man Jake Patterson, son of the couple who ran the general store. He was barely 19, a quiet boy who had never caused trouble, beyond occasionally sneaking a drink when his parents weren't watching. Now he lay still in a spreading pool of blood, killed over a card game he probably shouldn't have been playing. The killer stood against the far wall, flanked by 2 men whose hands rested openly on their guns. Margaret had never seen him before, a tall, thin man with prematurely white hair and eyes that showed no remorse for what he had just done. "Name's Garrett Blackwood," she heard someone whisper. "Came up from New Mexico territory. They say he's killed 8 men in fair fights." Sheriff Morrison approached Blackwood with obvious reluctance. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his voice lacking conviction. Blackwood smiled without warmth. "Happy to cooperate with local law enforcement, Sheriff. But you should know that young Patterson drew first. I was defending myself against an armed attacker. Plenty of witnesses here can confirm that." Margaret watched a dozen men nod in agreement, their faces showing the kind of intimidated compliance that armed men could command. She understood immediately that Blackwood hadn't just killed Jake Patterson. He had announced his presence in Cedar Falls with calculated violence designed to establish his position in the local hierarchy. Thomas took her arm gently. "We should go home," he said quietly. "There's nothing more we can do here tonight." But as they walked back toward their house, Margaret felt something fundamental had changed in their community. The balance that had kept Cedar Falls relatively peaceful had been shattered by a man who understood that fear was more effective than respect for maintaining control. Over the following weeks, that understanding proved increasingly accurate. Blackwood and his associates, she learned their names were Davis, Martinez, and Stone, established themselves as the dominant force in the Silver Dollar District. Their influence extended beyond the saloon through a network of intimidation that touched every aspect of Cedar Falls. Commerce. Store owners who had never paid protection money found themselves dealing with mysterious fires and broken windows until they agreed to reasonable insurance arrangements. Miners who complained about working conditions discovered that accidents occurred more frequently to troublemakers than to cooperative workers. Even the legitimate businesses weren't immune. Thomas learned that the territorial education grant for their academy project had been delayed indefinitely due to concerns about Cedar Falls' stability and ability to provide proper supervision for educational funds. "They're strangling the town," Thomas told Margaret after attending a town council meeting that accomplished nothing beyond establishing everyone's unwillingness to confront the new reality. "Morrison is either bought or frightened into uselessness. The decent people are too scattered and too scared to organize resistance." Margaret felt the truth of his assessment in her daily life. Parents began keeping their children home from school when rumors circulated about strangers asking questions about families and their activities. The evening community events she had organized stopped happening as people avoided gathering in groups that might attract unwanted attention. Their house began to feel like an island of normalcy in a community transformed by fear. They maintained their teaching schedules and their commitment to their students, but even the schoolhouse felt different. Children arrived looking over their shoulders and left quickly when dismissal came. The situation deteriorated further when Blackwood decided that the town's educational leadership represented a potential threat to his growing influence. Education encouraged people to think independently, to question authority, and to organize for mutual benefit, all dangerous concepts for someone whose power depended on keeping people isolated and afraid. Thomas first sensed this scrutiny when he noticed men lounging near the schoolhouse during class hours, ostensibly waiting for friends or conducting business, but actually observing the daily routines of Cedar Falls teachers. Margaret confirmed his suspicions when she recognized the same faces appearing repeatedly in places where they had no obvious business. "They're studying us," she told Thomas one evening as they reviewed the day's lessons. "Learning our schedules, our habits, our vulnerabilities." Thomas had reached the same conclusion. "The question is whether they plan to intimidate us into compliance or eliminate us as obstacles to their control." The answer came sooner than either expected. Margaret arrived at the schoolhouse on a Monday morning to find her desk ransacked and her carefully prepared materials scattered across the floor. But unlike the previous vandalism, this destruction carried a specific message. Every paper related to their correspondence with territorial education authorities had been taken. Thomas's desk showed the same systematic attention. Letters from potential funding sources, reports on student progress, and documentation of their academy plans all gone. The message was clear. Their efforts to bring outside attention and resources to Cedar Falls would not be tolerated. But Blackwood had underestimated the determination of two people who had staked their lives on the belief that education could overcome ignorance and fear. Instead of retreating, Thomas and Margaret decided to accelerate their efforts to bring legitimate authority to bear on Cedar Falls' situation. Thomas composed careful letters to territorial officials, documenting the intimidation and violence that were destroying their community. Margaret wrote to educational institutions and women's organizations, describing conditions that made normal civic life impossible. They were careful to send their correspondence through channels that bypassed local scrutiny, asking traveling merchants to post letters from other towns, using Margaret's connections with the railroad to send messages through conductors who could mail them from distant stations. For a few weeks, their caution seemed effective. They received encouraging responses from territorial authorities who promised investigation and support. Educational institutions expressed interest in their academy project despite the current difficulties, but their success in circumventing local surveillance also escalated the stakes of their conflict with Blackwood. As reports began filtering back to Cedar Falls about territorial interest in the town's affairs, Blackwood realized that the schoolteachers represented a more serious threat than he had initially recognized. On a warm evening in early May, as Thomas and Margaret worked late preparing for end-of-term examinations, a delegation visited their home. Blackwood himself led the group, accompanied by Davis and Martinez, along with two men Margaret didn't recognize out-of-town professionals, whose presence suggested this was no casual social call. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," Blackwood said with exaggerated politeness as Margaret opened their door. "I hope you'll forgive the late hour, but I have a business proposition that requires immediate attention." Thomas appeared behind Margaret, his hand resting on the rifle he kept near the door. "State your business, Mr. Blackwood." "Please call me Garrett. We're going to be neighbors for a long time, and I believe in maintaining friendly relationships with community leaders." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. "I've heard about your plans for expanding the school, and I think Cedar Falls would benefit from your success." He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. "I'd like to make a substantial donation to your academy project. Let's say $5,000, with more available as construction progresses." Margaret felt her breath catch. $5,000 represented more funding than they had hoped to raise from all sources combined. It would allow them to build the academy of their dreams and establish Cedar Falls as an educational center for the entire territory. But the price of accepting Blackwood's generosity was obvious in his next words. Of course, such a significant investment would require certain understandings about curriculum and educational priorities. "We wouldn't want the academy teaching subjects that might give young people inappropriate ideas about challenging legitimate authority or questioning established business arrangements." Thomas's response came without hesitation. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Blackwood, but we cannot accept funding that comes with restrictions on academic freedom." Blackwood's smile faded slightly. "That's disappointing, Thomas. I had hoped we could reach a mutually beneficial arrangement." "We can," Thomas replied firmly. "You can allow us to operate our school without interference, and we can continue educating the children of Cedar Falls according to proper educational standards. I'm afraid that arrangement doesn't adequately protect my investment in this community's future," Blackwood said, his voice losing all pretense of friendliness. "But I'm a patient man. Perhaps you'll reconsider my offer after you've had more time to think about the challenges facing educators who lack community support." The threat was unmistakable, but so was Thomas's determination. "Our answer will be the same tomorrow as it is tonight." After Blackwood and his men departed, Margaret and Thomas sat in their kitchen, understanding that they had crossed a line from which there might be no safe return. They had chosen principle over security, academic integrity over personal safety. "We could leave," Margaret said quietly. "Request transfers to schools in safer communities." Thomas took her hand. "And abandon our students to whatever passes for education under Blackwood's influence? Some things are worth the risk, Margaret." She knew he was right. Their students deserved teachers who wouldn't compromise their futures for temporary safety. Their community deserved educators who understood that civilization required people willing to defend its fundamental values, that they would continue their work, but with full knowledge that they had made enemies who possessed both the means and the willingness to eliminate obstacles to their ambitions. The storm they had been watching gather was about to break with devastating force. Territorial Marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning, riding into Cedar Falls with the authority of federal law and the confidence of a man who had seen every variety of frontier corruption. Marshal Samuel Hayes was 53 years old, with iron gray hair and scars that spoke of 20 years enforcing justice in places Where local law had failed or been compromised, Margaret watched him dismount outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, noting how his presence immediately changed the atmosphere on Main Street. Men who had swaggered with impunity under Blackwood's protection suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The loungers who had made a habit of intimidating passers-by melted away like shadows at sunrise. Thomas joined her at the schoolhouse window, following her gaze toward the tall figure now entering the saloon. "Think he's here about our letters?" he asked quietly. "Has to be," Margaret replied. "The timing is too perfect to be coincidental." Their correspondence with territorial authorities had finally produced results. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas had sent a detailed report documenting the violence and intimidation that had transformed Cedar Falls. Margaret had provided supporting testimony about the systematic destruction of civic institutions and the climate of fear that prevented normal community life. The response had come faster than either had dared hope. A terse telegram stating that Marshal Hayes would conduct a full investigation into allegations of criminal conspiracy and federal law violations in Cedar Falls. The telegram had been signed by Territorial Governor Crawford himself, but Margaret felt a chill of apprehension alongside her relief. Blackwood's network extended beyond Cedar Falls, and powerful men protected their investments with whatever means necessary. Hayes represented justice, but he was also walking into a situation where too many people had too much to lose from honest law enforcement. The marshal spent his first day in methodical interviews, starting with Sheriff Morrison and working through a list that included prominent merchants, mine supervisors, and civic leaders. Margaret noticed that he avoided the schoolhouse initially, perhaps understanding that his association with them might put them in additional danger. His presence had an immediate effect on Blackwood's operations. The systematic intimidation that had become routine in Cedar Falls paused as criminals waited to assess whether Hayes represented a serious threat or merely another official who could be bought or frightened away. That evening, Dr. Wheeler stopped by the Caldwell house with news from his rounds. As the town's only physician, Wheeler heard everything that happened in Cedar Falls, from deathbed confessions to drunken boasts in the Silver Dollar. "Hayes interviewed me this afternoon," Wheeler reported, accepting Margaret's offer of coffee. "Asked specific questions about Jake Patterson's death, about the increase in accidents since Blackwood arrived, about patterns I might have noticed in injuries brought to my practice." Thomas leaned forward. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. Jake Patterson was shot in the back. There was no fair fight. Half the mining accidents I've treated show signs of deliberate sabotage. And the women who come to me with bruises aren't getting them from clumsy falls." Wheeler's voice carried the anger of a medical man who had seen too much unnecessary suffering. Margaret felt a surge of hope. If Hayes could gather enough testimony from credible witnesses, he might have grounds for federal charges that would remove Blackwood and his associates permanently from Cedar Falls. But Wheeler's next words tempered her optimism. "Problem is, most folks are too scared to talk on the record. They'll whisper to me in confidence, but when it comes to signing statements or testifying before federal magistrates, they remember they have families to protect." Thomas understood the dilemma. Fear is Blackwood's most effective weapon. Even if people want justice, they can't risk retribution against their children. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at their door, not the polite tap of a social caller, but the firm rapping of official business. Thomas opened the door to find Marshal Hayes himself, still wearing his travel-stained coat and carrying the leather portfolio that contained his investigation materials. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," Hayes said formally, "I apologize for the late hour, but I need to speak with you both about the letters you sent to territorial authorities." Margaret invited him in, noting how the marshal's experienced eyes quickly assessed their home's layout, exits, potential hiding places, defensive positions. It was the automatic surveillance of a man who had survived by being prepared for trouble. Hayes accepted her offer of coffee, but remained standing. His attention focused on the windows and doors, even as he spoke. Your correspondence provided the framework for my investigation, but I need more specific information. Names, dates, witnesses who might be willing to provide sworn testimony. Over the next hour, Thomas and Margaret provided detailed accounts of everything they had witnessed or heard about Blackwood's activities. Hayes took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting additional details about specific incidents. The challenge, Hayes explained when they finished, is building a case that will stand up in federal court. Blackwood is careful to maintain plausible deniability for most of his operations. The direct violence is carried out by subordinates, while he presents himself as a legitimate businessman who deplores the lawlessness that seems to follow him everywhere. Margaret understood the legal complications, but she sensed something else in Hayes' manner, a tension that suggested his investigation had uncovered more than simple local corruption. "Marshal," she said carefully, "is there something you're not telling us? Some reason why this case requires more than standard federal intervention?" Hayes studied her for a moment, perhaps weighing how much he could safely reveal. "Blackwood isn't operating independently," he said finally. "We have evidence suggesting he's part of a larger organization that specializes in taking control of boomtowns, extracting maximum profit, then moving on when resources are exhausted or law enforcement becomes too troublesome." Thomas felt the implications sink in. "You're saying Cedar Falls is just one target in a systematic criminal enterprise?" "Exactly. Which means Blackwood has resources and connections that extend far beyond what we see here. He can call in reinforcements, influence territorial politics, even threaten federal officials who interfere with his operations." Hayes' expression was grim. "It also means he won't simply retreat when confronted. He'll fight to protect an investment that represents more than local criminal activity." The revelation transformed their understanding of the danger they faced. They weren't dealing with ordinary outlaws who might be discouraged by federal attention, but with organized criminals whose operations required permanent elimination of opposition. "What do you need from us?" Margaret asked, her voice steady, despite the fear she felt. "Continue doing exactly what you've been doing. Maintain normal routines, document anything unusual you observe, and stay alert for signs that Blackwood is preparing to escalate his response to my investigation." Hayes paused. "But also be prepared to leave Cedar Falls quickly if circumstances require it. I can arrange federal protection for you and your students if this situation deteriorates beyond local law enforcement capabilities." After Hayes departed, Thomas and Margaret sat in their kitchen, understanding that their conflict with Blackwood had evolved into something far more dangerous than a dispute over local school policies. They were now witnesses in a federal investigation that could destroy a criminal organization worth thousands of dollars in stolen wealth. "We could accept his offer of federal protection," Margaret said quietly. "Leave tomorrow and let Hayes handle this without risking our lives." Thomas took her hand. "And abandon our students to whatever educational system Blackwood would establish. Some battles choose the people who fight them, Margaret. I think this is one of those battles." She knew he was right, but the weight of responsibility felt crushing. Their decision to resist Blackwood had seemed like a simple choice between right and wrong. Now it carried implications that extended far beyond their personal safety, or even their community's welfare. The next morning brought news that validated Hayes' warnings about Blackwood's resources. Margaret arrived at the schoolhouse to find a message pinned to the door. "Marshal Hayes has been reassigned to investigate disturbances in Wyoming territory. Federal investigation of Cedar Falls terminated due to lack of evidence supporting criminal charges." The message bore official territorial letterhead and appeared authentic, but something about its timing and content raised Margaret's suspicions. She took the notice directly to Hayes at the hotel where he was staying. Hayes examined the document with growing anger. "This is a forgery," he said flatly. I haven't been reassigned, and my investigation is nowhere near complete. Someone with access to official letterhead is trying to convince you that federal support has been withdrawn." But even as he spoke, Hayes recognized the sophistication of the deception. Creating convincing official documents required resources and connections that confirmed his suspicions about Blackwood's backing. "This proves we're dealing with corruption that reaches into territorial administration," Hayes said grimly. "Someone with significant influence is protecting Blackwood's operations." The implications were chilling. If territorial officials were compromised, Hayes' investigation could be terminated through legitimate channels at any time. Federal protection for witnesses might be withdrawn without warning. Even Hayes himself might be reassigned to remove the threat he represented to powerful interests. Margaret felt the walls closing in around their small community. Local law enforcement was compromised, territorial officials were unreliable, and federal intervention might be subject to political manipulation. The isolation that had once protected Cedar Falls from outside corruption now trapped them with criminals who possessed resources they had never imagined. But the forged notice also represented a strategic mistake on Blackwood's part. By attempting to deceive them about federal support, he had revealed both the extent of his political connections and his desperation to end Hayes' investigation. Quickly, he's worried, Margaret realized. If Blackwood had complete confidence in his protection, he wouldn't need to forge documents to discourage us from cooperating with you. Hayes nodded. "Exactly. Which means we have a narrow window to gather evidence before his political allies can legitimately terminate my investigation. I need sworn statements from credible witnesses, physical evidence of criminal activity, and documentation that proves systematic rather than random criminal behavior." Over the following 3 days, Hayes worked with quiet intensity to build his case. Dr. Wheeler provided medical records, documenting suspicious injuries and deaths. Store owners reluctantly admitted to paying protection money. Even some of Blackwood's own associates, sensing that federal attention might threaten their immunity, began providing information in exchange for promises of reduced charges. Margaret and Thomas served as coordinators for this evidence-gathering effort, using their connections throughout the community to identify potential witnesses and their knowledge of local affairs to help Hayes understand the full scope of Blackwood's operations. But their visible cooperation with the federal investigation also made them increasingly obvious targets for retaliation. Margaret noticed strangers watching the schoolhouse more frequently. Thomas discovered evidence that someone had been inside their house while they were teaching. Nothing stolen, but personal belongings moved just enough to send a message about their vulnerability. The pressure escalated when one of their students, young Sally Chun, arrived at school with a message from her father. The Chun family would be sending their children to a different school, one that maintained better discipline and more appropriate curriculum. The message was polite, but Margaret understood that Mr. Chun had been threatened with consequences if his children continued attending classes taught by federal informants. By the end of the week, enrollment had dropped by nearly half as families chose safety over education. The systematic intimidation was achieving its goal of isolating Thomas and Margaret from community support while demonstrating the cost of opposing Blackwood's control. Hayes recognized the deteriorating situation. During his final interview with the Caldwells, "I have enough evidence to file federal charges," he reported. "But prosecuting them successfully will require time. And I'm not sure we have time before Blackwood decides that eliminating witnesses is more efficient than discrediting them." Margaret felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. They could leave with Hayes, accepting federal protection and hoping that justice would eventually prevail through distant courts. Or they could remain, continuing their work while hoping that Blackwood's caution would prevent him from taking more direct action against federal witnesses. Thomas made the choice for both of them. "We stay," he said firmly. "Our students need U.S., and running away sends the message that education isn't worth defending against intimidation. Hayes nodded grimly. Then we prepare for the possibility that Blackwood will escalate beyond intimidation. Can you handle firearms? Margaret thought of the Derringer in her purse, but suspected Hayes was talking about something more substantial. We can learn, she said. Then learn quickly, Hayes replied. Because I have a feeling we're about to find out just how far Blackwood is willing to go to protect his investment in Cedar Falls. The storm clouds were gathering, and Margaret could feel the electricity in the air that preceded violence. Their choice to stand firm had bought time for justice, but it had also ensured that when Blackwood finally acted, his response would be swift, decisive, and lethal. The telegraph lines went down on a Sunday morning, cut cleanly in 3 places between Cedar Falls and the outside world. Marshal Hayes discovered the sabotage during his routine communication check with territorial headquarters, finding only dead silence where he expected confirmation of federal arrest warrants for Blackwood and his associates. Margaret watched. Hayes examined the severed wires behind the telegraph office, his experienced hands tracing cuts that showed deliberate planning rather than weather damage or accident. The isolation was complete, now no way to call for federal backup, no method of reporting developments to territorial authorities, no means of warning the outside world if Blackwood decided to eliminate all witnesses to his criminal activities. How long to repair the lines? Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Parts would have to come from Denver, Hayes replied grimly. 2 weeks minimum, assuming we could get a repair crew willing to work under these circumstances. He gestured toward the Silver Dollar, where Blackwood's men lounged in plain view, making no effort to conceal their role in the sabotage. The message was unmistakable. Cedar Falls now existed as an island, cut off from federal authority and subject only to whatever law Blackwood chose to impose. Any resistance would be crushed without outside interference, any witnesses eliminated without fear of federal retaliation. But Hayes had anticipated this possibility. The night before, he had taken precautions that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. Margaret learned about them when a stranger approached the schoolhouse during Monday morning classes, a weathered man in his 40s who introduced himself as Deputy Marshal James Crawford. Hayes sent me to collect evidence and testimony before the situation deteriorates further, Crawford explained, producing credentials that appeared authentic. We need everything you can provide about Blackwood's operations, including names of associates, details of criminal activities, and any documentation that might support federal charges. Margaret felt relief flood through her. Hayes had managed to get word to his superiors before the telegraph lines were cut, ensuring that federal authorities knew about Blackwood's actions, even if they couldn't communicate directly with Cedar Falls. Thomas gathered their carefully documented evidence, while Margaret prepared written testimony describing everything they had witnessed. Crawford proved knowledgeable about federal law enforcement procedures, asking intelligent questions that helped them organize their information effectively. But something about Crawford's manner troubled Margaret without her being able to identify the source of her unease. His questions were appropriate, his credentials seemed legitimate, yet her instincts whispered warnings she couldn't explain rationally. The answer came 3 hours later when Hayes burst into the schoolhouse with fury written across his face. "Where is he?" Hayes demanded. "Where's the man who claimed to be Deputy Crawford?" Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. "He's not a federal deputy. There is no Deputy Crawford in the Territorial Marshal Service," Hayes said grimly. "Whoever that was, he just walked out of here with every piece of evidence we've gathered against Blackwood's organization." The sophistication of the deception staggered her. Someone had created false credentials, researched federal procedures well enough to conduct a convincing interview, and executed a plan that eliminated months of careful evidence gathering in a single morning. Thomas sank into his desk chair, the full implications washing over him. "They have our testimony, our documentation." names of everyone who provided information. His voice carried the weight of a man who realized he had been outmaneuvered by professionals. "It's worse than that," Hayes continued. "With your evidence in their hands, they know exactly what we can prove and what we can't. They know which witnesses pose the greatest threat, which officials might support federal intervention, and how much time they have before my absence raises questions in territorial headquarters." Margaret understood that they had crossed from dangerous territory into hopeless circumstances. Blackwood now possessed complete intelligence about federal efforts against his organization, while maintaining absolute control over communication and transportation in and out of Cedar Falls. "We could try to reach the nearest town," she suggested. "Ride out tonight and bring back federal reinforcements." Hayes shook his head. "Blackwood's men have been watching every trail since yesterday. Nobody leaves Cedar Falls without his permission. We're trapped here until he decides what to do with us." The waiting began that afternoon. Margaret tried to maintain normal classroom routines with the handful of students whose parents still dared to send them to school, but concentration proved impossible when every sound might signal the approach of armed men. Thomas spent the day checking and rechecking the rifle Hayes had provided, loading and unloading cartridges with the nervous energy of someone who had never expected to defend his life with violence. His hands shook slightly as he practiced the loading procedure Hayes had demonstrated. "I'm not a gunfighter," Thomas admitted as evening approached. "I've never shot anything more dangerous than a wolf threatening livestock." "Neither am I," Margaret replied, checking her own weapon, a heavier revolver Hayes had insisted she carry instead of her small Derringer. "But we're not trying to win a gunfight. We're trying to survive long enough for justice to arrive." Hayes joined them for dinner, his presence both reassuring and ominous. A federal marshal eating in their kitchen meant they had powerful protection. It also meant they needed that protection desperately. "Blackwood's planning something for tonight," Hayes reported between bites of Margaret's stew. "Too much activity around the silver dollar, too many horses being readied, too many men checking weapons who don't usually carry them." Margaret felt her appetite disappear. What kind of something? Could be they're planning to run abandoned Cedar Falls before federal reinforcements arrive. Could be they're planning to eliminate witnesses and claim we were killed in an unfortunate gunfight with desperate criminals. Hayes' matter-of-fact tone made the possibility sound like weather predictions. "Which do you think is more likely?" Thomas asked. Hayes considered the question carefully. "Blackwood's invested too much in Cedar Falls to abandon it easily. The mine is producing thousands of dollars monthly. His protection rackets are generating steady income, and he's built a base of operations that would be expensive to recreate elsewhere." Margaret understood the logic. "So he eliminates the immediate threat and continues business as usual." "Exactly. 3 bodies in the morning, federal marshal and 2 schoolteachers killed while resisting arrest for false accusations against respected community leaders." Blackwood expresses regret about the violence, but cooperates fully with territorial authorities investigating the unfortunate incident. The scenario was plausible enough to convince distant officials who had no direct knowledge of Cedar Falls' situation. By the time federal reinforcements arrived, they would find a community mourning the loss of its teachers and grateful for the leadership that had restored order after a period of lawlessness. As darkness fell, Hayes positioned them strategically throughout the house. Margaret took the kitchen window that overlooked the main approach from town. Thomas covered the back door and the path leading from the mountains. Hayes himself watched the front door and the schoolhouse, where any attack would likely begin. Waiting stretched through the longest hours of Margaret's life. Every shadow moving in moonlight could be an approaching gunman. Every sound from the direction of town might signal the beginning of their final confrontation with Blackwood's organization. Near midnight, the attack began with systematic precision that spoke of military planning. Margaret saw the first flames rising from the schoolhouse, not random arson, but deliberate destruction designed to flush them from their defensive positions. "They're burning the school," she called to Hayes. "Let it burn," he replied grimly. "It's bait to get us into the open where they can surround us." But Thomas had invested 3 years of his life in that building and everything it represented. Against Hayes' shouted orders, he bolted from the back door toward the flames. Driven by the teacher's instinct to save the institution he had built, Margaret watched in horror as muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the burning schoolhouse. Thomas made it halfway across the yard before a rifle bullet spun him around and dropped him to the ground. She was moving before conscious thought intervened, running toward her fallen husband while Hayes provided covering fire from the house. Bullets whined past her ears and kicked up dirt around her feet, but somehow she reached Thomas without being hit. He was still alive, blood spreading across his shirt from a wound in his chest, but his eyes focused on her with desperate urgency. "The safe," he whispered, "behind the desk." Documents Hayes needs, Margaret understood. Thomas had hidden copies of their evidence in the schoolhouse safe, insurance against exactly the kind of theft they had experienced that morning. If she could reach those documents, Hayes might still have grounds for federal charges against Blackwood. "Stay here," she told Thomas, though moving him would have been impossible even if safety existed somewhere nearby. The schoolhouse blazed like a torch, but the safe stood in the back corner where flames hadn't yet reached. Margaret ran through smoke and heat, dodging falling timbers and breathing air that seared her lungs. The safe opened to her touch. Thomas had given her the combination months earlier as part of their partnership in all aspects of their work. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were copies of every document they had provided to the false Deputy Crawford, along with additional materials Thomas had held in reserve. She grabbed the entire bundle and turned to flee, but found her path blocked by a figure silhouetted against the flames. Garrett Blackwood himself stood in the doorway, his gun trained on her heart. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said with mock courtesy. "Such dedication to education, risking your life for a few pieces of paper." Margaret clutched the documents against her chest, understanding that they represented the only remaining hope for justice in Cedar Falls. "These papers prove what you are," she said. "These papers prove nothing without witnesses to authenticate them, and I'm afraid all the witnesses will shortly be unavailable for testimony." Blackwood's smile was visible even in the flickering light. "Your husband is dying in the yard. Marshal Hayes is surrounded by my men, and you're about to perish tragically in this unfortunate fire." But Blackwood had made the same mistake that doomed many intelligent criminals he talked to, long instead of acting immediately. Margaret used his monologue to edge closer to a window that might offer escape, clutching the precious documents while preparing to risk everything on a desperate gamble. "The territorial authorities will investigate," she said, trying to keep him talking. "Federal marshals don't disappear without consequences." "Federal marshals die in the line of duty with unfortunate regularity," Blackwood replied. Hayes was investigating dangerous criminals who killed him rather than submit to arrest. These things happen on the frontier. Margaret reached the window and made her choice. Rather than jumping to safety, she threw the bundle of documents through the opening with all her strength, hoping they would land far enough from the burning building to survive what was about to happen. Blackwood's curse told her the throw had been successful, but his immediate response eliminated her own chances of survival. His shot took her in the shoulder, spinning her around and dropping her to the floor amid the burning debris. "Stupid woman," Blackwood snarled, advancing toward her with his gun raised for a finishing shot. "You've accomplished nothing except making your death more painful." But Margaret had accomplished exactly what she intended. The documents lay in the yard where Hayes might recover them. Thomas might still be alive and able to testify, and Blackwood had revealed himself as the killer of 2 federal witnesses as the schoolhouse collapsed around them in a shower of sparks. And flame, Margaret smiled through her pain, knowing that justice might yet prevail, even if she didn't live to see it. The shot that ended her life echoed across Cedar Falls like thunder, announcing the moment when a schoolteacher's wife became a martyr to the principle that some things were worth dying to defend. But death, Margaret would soon discover, was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of her quest for justice. Death was not the peaceful release Margaret had expected. Instead of fading into eternal rest, she found herself suspended in a realm of shifting shadows and whispered voices, caught between the world she had left and whatever lay beyond. Time moved strangely here, sometimes racing forward in blurred glimpses of Cedar Falls, sometimes crawling with the weight of every injustice left unresolved. She could see the aftermath of that terrible night unfolding like scenes viewed through clouded glass. Marshall Hayes had survived Blackwood's ambush, wounded but alive, hidden in the root cellar beneath their house until dawn revealed the extent of the devastation. The schoolhouse was ash and charred timbers. Thomas lay dead in the yard where he had fallen, and Margaret's own body had been consumed in the flames that Blackwood claimed had started accidentally during a confrontation with dangerous criminals. The official story spread through Cedar Falls with the efficiency of a well-orchestrated lie. Thomas and Margaret Caldwell had been secretly working with criminal elements, using their teaching positions to gather intelligence for a robbery gang that planned to target the silver shipments from the mine. When Marshall Hayes attempted to arrest them, they had resisted violently, leading to a tragic gunfight that left 2 fine educators dead and their school destroyed. Blackwood himself delivered the eulogy at their funeral, speaking with apparent grief about the corruption that could infect even the most trusted members of a community. He announced the establishment of a new school, funded by his own generosity, that would provide proper education free from the criminal influences that had tainted the previous institution. But Margaret could see what the living could not: the threads of truth that connected events across time and space. She watched Hayes recover the documents she had thrown from the burning schoolhouse, saw him hide them in places where Blackwood's searches would never find them. She observed the growing resistance among Cedar Falls residents who refused to believe the lies about their beloved teachers. Most importantly, she witnessed the arrival of forces that would ultimately bring justice to her community, even if that justice would take forms that none of the living could anticipate. The first sign came through young Billy Patterson, Jake's younger brother, who had inherited more than his siblings' gentle nature. Billy possessed what his grandmother called the sight, an ability to perceive things that existed beyond normal vision. 3 days after the funeral, Billy began reporting conversations with Mrs. Caldwell, who appeared to him in the cemetery where their bodies had been laid to rest. "She says the truth is buried, but not dead," Billy told his parents with the matter-of-fact tone children use for extraordinary revelations. "She says the papers are hidden where only honest eyes will find them, and that justice will come wearing her face." His parents dismissed the claims as grief-induced imagination, but Dr. Wheeler paid closer attention when Billy described details about the night of the fire that had never been made public. The boy knew about Margaret's desperate run to save the evidence, about the documents hidden in places Hayes had never revealed, about conversations between Blackwood and his men that no living person had overheard. Wheeler began visiting the cemetery regularly, ostensibly to tend the graves of patients he had been unable to save, but actually hoping to experience whatever phenomenon young Billy had encountered. His vigil was rewarded on a night when the moon hung dark and the mountain wind carried voices from places that had no names. Margaret appeared to him first as a presence felt rather than seen, a coldness in the air that spoke of unfinished business and unquiet rest. Gradually, her form took shape among the headstones, translucent but unmistakably the woman he had known and respected. "The evidence Hayes gathered still exists," she told him, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "But it requires living hands to present it to living courts. The dead can see truth, but only the living can speak it. Wheeler found himself believing without question, perhaps because his medical training had taught him that phenomena beyond current understanding were not necessarily impossible. "What do you need me to do?" "Find Sarah McKinnon," Margaret replied. "She arrives on tomorrow's train, sent by territorial authorities who received Hayes' final report before the telegraph lines were cut. She has the authority to investigate federal crimes and the integrity to resist Blackwood's corruption." The conversation continued through the darkest hours of night, with Margaret providing information that only the dead could possess, details about Blackwood's organization that no living investigator could have discovered, names of associates hidden in distant territories, locations where evidence of their crimes lay waiting for honest authorities to uncover. When dawn approached, Margaret's form began to fade, but her final words carried a promise that chilled Wheeler despite his growing determination to help her. "Justice will be done, Doctor. If the living cannot provide it, the dead will find another way." Sarah McKinnon proved to be everything Margaret had promised as a FACOMist, federal investigator with 15 years of experience in territorial corruption cases and a reputation for honesty that had made her enemies among criminals and corrupt officials. Throughout the West, she arrived in Cedar Falls without announcement, traveling under an assumed name and carrying credentials that gave her authority to supersede local law enforcement when federal crimes were suspected. Her investigation began with a visit to Dr. Wheeler, whose medical records provided scientific documentation of the violence that had accompanied Blackwood's rise to power. Wheeler shared everything Margaret had told him, understanding that his credibility as a physician would lend weight to revelations that might otherwise be dismissed as superstition. McKinnon proved surprisingly receptive to information obtained through supernatural means. "I've learned not to question sources that provide accurate intelligence," she told Wheeler. "If your ghostly schoolteacher can lead me to evidence that will convict criminals, I'm willing to follow her guidance." The first breakthrough came when Margaret appeared to Billy Patterson again, this time providing specific directions to a cache of documents Hayes had hidden in a hollow tree near Silver Creek. The papers included original correspondence between Blackwood and his superiors in the criminal organization, financial records showing the transfer of stolen wealth, and detailed plans for expanding their operations to other mining communities. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source, Blackwood's own men, whose loyalty began wavering when they realized their leader had made them accessories to the murder of federal witnesses. Margaret somehow knew which of them could be turned, appearing to them in dreams that left them awakened with knowledge of their own mortality and the certain consequences of continued criminal activity. Davis, Blackwood's lieutenant who had participated in the schoolhouse attack, came to McKinnon voluntarily after 3 nights of visions that showed him his own death in vivid detail. His testimony provided insider knowledge of the organization's structure, methods, and future plans that no external investigation could have uncovered. "She came to me every night," Davis told McKinnon during his formal confession. "Mrs. Caldwell, looking exactly like she did in life, but with bullet holes in her dress and fire in her eyes. She showed me what would happen if I didn't tell the truth, how I would die, when I would die, what my final moments would feel like." Martinez and Stone followed within days, each driven by supernatural encounters that convinced them their only hope of survival lay in cooperation with federal authorities. Their combined testimonies provided a complete picture of Blackwood's criminal enterprise and its connections to corrupt officials in territorial government. But Blackwood himself remained untouchable, protected by political allies who had received advance warning of McKinnon's investigation. Word came through official channels that the federal inquiry had been suspended pending review of jurisdictional questions, and that McKinnon was being reassigned to investigate cattle rustling in Wyoming Territory. Margaret's response to this betrayal manifested in ways that terrified even those who had grown accustomed to her supernatural presence. The temperature around Blackwood dropped noticeably whenever he appeared in public, frost forming on windows even in summer heat. His horse began refusing to carry him, bucking and rearing whenever he attempted to mount. Men who worked for him reported tools breaking in their hands and equipment failing at crucial moments. More disturbing were the personal encounters Blackwood began experiencing. Margaret appeared to him not as the gentle teacher she had been in life, but as an avatar of justice whose presence brought visions of his own crimes, played out in endless repetition. He found himself reliving Jake Patterson's murder, seeing the young man's face in every mirror, hearing his final words in every conversation. Sleep became impossible as Margaret visited his dreams with revelations of divine judgment and earthly consequences that awaited him. She showed him the federal investigation that would eventually expose his crimes, the prison cell where he would spend his final years, the unmarked grave where his body would rest without ceremony or mourning. "You killed an innocent man for defending himself at cards," Margaret told him during one of these nocturnal confrontations. "You murdered a teacher who wanted only to educate children. You destroyed a woman who died protecting evidence of your crimes. Justice will be done, Garrick Blackwood, whether by federal courts or divine intervention." Blackwood tried to flee Cedar Falls, but found his escape routes blocked by circumstances that defied rational explanation. Bridges collapsed as he approached them. Horses died mysteriously when he attempted to commandeer them. Telegraph messages he sent requesting evacuation never reached their destinations, though the wires carried other communications without difficulty. The supernatural siege continued for weeks, wearing down Blackwood's mental state until he began making mistakes that exposed vulnerabilities in his organization. He fired loyal subordinates based on paranoid suspicions, alienated political allies with increasingly erratic demands for protection, and drew attention to himself through public outbursts that suggested mental instability. McKinnon, officially reassigned but privately continuing her investigation through local allies, gathered intelligence about Blackwood's deteriorating condition with interest that bordered on fascination. "It's as if something is systematically destroying his ability to function," she observed to Dr. Wheeler. "Every support system he's built is being dismantled by forces I can't identify or explain." The explanation came through Margaret herself, who appeared to McKinnon with information that would prove crucial to the final resolution of the case. "Blackwood will attempt to escape tomorrow night," Margaret announced with the certainty of someone who had seen the future written in unchangeable script. "He will carry evidence of his crimes that he cannot bear to leave behind, documents that will convict not only him but his political protectors." McKinnon understood that this represented her final opportunity to achieve justice through legal means. If Blackwood escaped with his evidence, the criminal organization would survive to continue its operations elsewhere, and the deaths of Thomas and Margaret Caldwell would remain unpunished by earthly courts. But Margaret's plan for ensuring justice would require McKinnon to trust completely in supernatural intelligence and to risk her career on the word of a ghost whose motives might extend beyond simple law enforcement. "What do you need me to do?" McKinnon asked, echoing Dr. Wheeler's earlier question. Margaret's smile carried the cold satisfaction of someone who had waited months for this moment. "Be at the Silver Dollar Saloon tomorrow evening at sunset. Come armed, come alone, and be prepared to arrest a man whose guilt will be proven by evidence he brings to his own capture." The pieces were moving toward their final positions on a fiddle board where the living and the dead played by different rules, but shared the same objective. Justice would be served, Margaret had promised, and tomorrow would prove whether that justice required earthly courts or divine intervention. As Margaret's form faded back into the realm between worlds, McKinnon felt both anticipation and dread about what the next evening would bring. She had committed herself to trusting the dead to deliver the living to justice, gambling her reputation and possibly her life on the word of a woman who had already died for the truth. Tomorrow would reveal whether ghosts could indeed ensure that no crime went unpunished. No matter how powerful the criminals or how deep their corruption reached into territorial government, morning of the final confrontation dawned with an unnatural stillness that settled over Cedar Falls like a held breath. Birds that normally filled the mountain air with song remained silent in their nests. The wind that usually carried the scent of pine and wildflowers down from the peaks had died to absolute calm. Even the Silver Creek, which had babbled continuously through the valley for countless generations, seemed to flow more quietly, as if nature itself was preparing for judgment. Federal investigator Sarah McKinnon stood at her hotel room window, checking her weapons with the methodical precision of someone who had survived 15 years of dangerous assignments. Her Colt .44 was cleaned and loaded, her backup Derringer secured in her boot, and her badge polished to mirror brightness, not from vanity, but because she understood that symbols of authority sometimes carried more weight than bullets in frontier confrontations. She had spent the sleepless night reviewing every piece of evidence Margaret's supernatural guidance had helped her gather. Davis, Martinez, and Stone's confessions provided testimony that would convict Blackwood and his remaining associates. The hidden documents revealed the full scope of the criminal organization's operations across 3 territories. Most damning of all, McKinnon had obtained copies of correspondence between Blackwood and Territorial Governor Crawford's chief of staff, proving the corruption extended to the highest levels of government. But evidence meant nothing without the opportunity to present it in court, and that opportunity depended entirely on events that would unfold in the Silver Dollar Saloon in a few hours. McKinnon had built her career on careful planning and methodical investigation, yet tonight she was gambling everything on the word of a dead woman who claimed to know the future. The irony wasn't lost on her. Throughout her career, McKinnon had relied on facts, witnesses, and physical evidence to build cases against territorial criminals. Now faced with the most important arrest of her professional life, she was trusting intelligence gathered from beyond the grave by a schoolteacher who had died protecting the very evidence McKinnon hoped to use. Dr. Wheeler knocked softly on her door, carrying a medical bag that contained more than standard physician supplies. Margaret had appeared to him again before dawn, providing final instructions for his role in the evening's events. She says Blackwood will be carrying a leather portfolio containing financial records that prove his organization's connection to territorial officials, Wheeler reported. Documents he can't risk leaving behind but can't safely destroy because they're his insurance against betrayal by his political allies. McKinnon understood the psychology. Corrupt politicians who had protected Blackwood in exchange for shares of his profits would eliminate him if they thought he might be captured and forced to testify. The financial records proving their complicity were Blackwood's guarantee that any betrayal would be mutual destruction. "What else did she tell you?" McKinnon asked. Wheeler hesitated before answering. "She said the dead have been gathering in Cedar Falls. Every person Blackwood's organization has killed, every victim whose murder went unpunished, every soul whose death contributed to their criminal enterprise. They're all here, waiting for justice." McKinnon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She was a practical woman who believed in evidence and law enforcement, but her investigation had forced her to acknowledge realities that existed beyond courtrooms and federal regulations. If supernatural forces were indeed gathering to ensure justice, she hoped they would recognize her as an ally rather than another obstacle to be removed. The day passed with agonizing slowness as Cedar Falls prepared for a confrontation that most residents sensed without understanding. Store owners closed early and secured their shutters. Families gathered their children inside and bolted their doors. Even the usual crowd of miners and drifters that normally filled the Silver Dollar during afternoon hours seemed to find urgent business elsewhere. Young Billy Patterson, whose psychic sensitivity had first revealed Margaret's supernatural presence, spent the day in a state of increasing agitation. that worried his parents beyond their ability to comfort. He spoke of voices calling from the cemetery, of shadows moving when nothing cast them, of a gathering presence that filled him with both terror and anticipation. "They're all coming back," Billy told his mother as she tried to calm him with warm milk and gentle words. "All the people who were hurt. All the ones who died without getting justice. Mrs. Caldwell is leading them, and they're going to make things right." His mother, Ellen Patterson, had learned to take her son's visions seriously after his accurate predictions about the schoolhouse fire and the hidden evidence. She sent word to other families, warning them to stay indoors until whatever was building in Cedar Falls had run its course. As afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening, McKinnon made her final preparations. She pinned her federal badge prominently to her vest, ensuring that everyone in the Silver Dollar would recognize her authority. She double-checked her weapons and reviewed the arrest warrants she carried for Blackwood and his remaining associates. Most importantly, she rehearsed the words she would speak when confronting Blackwood, understanding that a single mistake in protocol could provide legal grounds for challenging any arrest she made. Federal law enforcement required precision, and territorial courts would scrutinize every detail of her actions. Margaret appeared to her one final time as sunset approached, materializing in McKinnon's hotel room with the solid presence of someone returning from a long journey. The ghostly schoolteacher no longer wore the burned dress in which she had died, but instead appeared in the simple black traveling outfit she had worn on the train to Cedar Falls months earlier. "It's time," Margaret said simply. "Are you ready to see justice done?" McKinnon felt an unexpected surge of emotion at the sight of this woman, who had died defending the evidence that would now convict her killers. "I'm ready, but Margaret, what happens after tonight? What happens to you when this is finished?" Margaret's smile carried the peace of someone who had completed an impossible task. "I don't know. Perhaps the dead rest easier when justice is done. Perhaps we move on to whatever comes after unfinished business is resolved." She paused, looking toward the window where the Silver Dollar Saloon was visible in the gathering dusk. "But I do know that tonight the truth will be spoken and heard." As Margaret's form began to fade, she offered one final piece of guidance. "Trust what you see, even if it challenges everything you've believed about the world. Justice takes many forms, and tonight you'll witness some that no law book describes." McKinnon holstered her gun, straightened her badge, and walked out into the evening air that seemed charged with electricity, despite the cloudless sky. The Silver Dollar Saloon blazed with light in the growing darkness, but the illumination felt cold rather than welcoming. Like firelight reflecting off ice, the streets of Cedar Falls were deserted except for McKinnon's solitary figure, walking purposefully toward the confrontation that would determine whether justice could indeed transcend death, whether the dead could compel the living to answer for their crimes, and whether a federal investigator's faith in supernatural guidance would prove worthy or foolish. Behind her, invisible to living eyes but perceptible to anyone sensitive to otherworldly presences, followed a gathering of spirits that included not only Margaret and Thomas Caldwell, but Jake Patterson, the miners who had died in mysterious accidents, the women who had been killed for resisting Blackwood's demands, and every other victim whose death had contributed to the criminal empire about to face its final reckoning. The Silver Dollar Saloon awaited, its swinging doors standing open like a mouth prepared to swallow whatever entered. Inside, Blackwood and his remaining associates conducted their final business in Cedar Falls, unaware that they were about to face judgment from both earthly and supernatural courts simultaneously. McKinnon paused outside the saloon doors, hearing the murmur of conversation from within, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, all the ordinary sounds of frontier nightlife that would soon be interrupted by extraordinary justice. She drew her weapon, checked that her badge was visible, and prepared to enter a place where the living and the dead would meet to settle accounts that had been too long outstanding. The moment had arrived for truth to be spoken, for evidence to be presented, and for justice to be served regardless of the political protections that had shielded criminals from earthly consequences. McKinnon stepped through the doors into lamplight and tobacco smoke, into a room where 23 men sat frozen in surprise at the sight of a federal badge worn by a woman whose determination burned as bright as the oil flames illuminating their faces. But she was not alone in that room, though only she could sense the supernatural witnesses who had gathered to ensure that this final confrontation would end with justice rather than another cover-up. The dead had indeed come to claim their due, and the living would discover that some debts could not be escaped through political influence or criminal violence. The reckoning was about to begin, and neither heaven nor hell would rest until every account was balanced. The Silver Dollar Saloon fell silent as federal investigator Sarah McKinnon stepped through the batwing doors, her badge catching the lamplight like a star pinned to her vest. 23 men turned to stare at this unexpected intrusion into their evening of cards, whiskey, and the kind of business conducted away from respectable eyes. Garrett Blackwood sat at his usual corner table, the leather portfolio McKinnon had been told about resting within arm's reach. His remaining associates, men who had survived the supernatural siege of the past weeks, flanked him with the nervous alertness of animals sensing a predator they couldn't identify. "Gentlemen," McKinnon announced, her voice carrying the authority of federal law across the suddenly quiet room. "I am federal investigator Sarah McKinnon, and I'm here to execute arrest warrants for crimes against the United States territory of Colorado." Blackwood's smile held the confidence of a man protected by powerful allies. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake, Miss McKinnon. No federal crimes have been committed in Cedar Falls. Perhaps you should check with territorial authorities before making embarrassing accusations against respected community leaders." But as Blackwood spoke, the temperature in the saloon began to drop noticeably. Frost formed on the windows despite the warm evening air outside. The oil lamps flickered as if touched by winds that carried no earthly origin. McKinnon felt the supernatural presence gathering around her, invisible to the criminals, but as real as the wooden floor beneath her feet. Margaret Caldwell was keeping her promise that justice would be witnessed by more than living eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," McKinnon said, producing the arrest warrants from her coat, "you are under arrest for the murders of Thomas and Margaret Caldwell, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and operating a criminal enterprise across territorial boundaries." She paused, letting the charges sink in. "You have the right to surrender peacefully and face trial in federal court." Blackwood's laughter echoed off the saloon walls, but the sound carried an edge of hysteria that revealed his deteriorating mental state. "Arrest me? On what evidence?" The Caldwells died in an accidental fire while resisting legitimate law enforcement. Any witnesses to the contrary are either dead or discredited. "That's where you're wrong," McKinnon replied, her voice steady despite the increasingly unnatural atmosphere in the saloon. "I have sworn testimony from 3 of your former associates, physical evidence of your criminal activities, and documentation proving your organization's scope extends far beyond Cedar Falls." She gestured toward the men flanking Blackwood. "Davis, Martinez, and Stone have provided complete confessions in exchange for federal protection. They've testified about the systematic murder of witnesses, the corruption of local officials, and the interstate transportation of stolen goods." For the first time since McKinnon's arrival, uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's features. His political protectors had assured him that federal investigation would be terminated, that any evidence against him would be suppressed or discredited. But McKinnon's confidence suggested she possessed information his allies couldn't control. "Lies told by desperate men trying to save themselves," Blackwood said, but his hand moved unconsciously toward the portfolio that contained the very evidence that would confirm those lies as truth. McKinnon noticed the gesture. That portfolio You're so protective of it contains financial records proving your organization's connections to territorial officials, doesn't it? Documents showing how Governor Crawford's administration has been protecting your operations in exchange for substantial payments. Blackwood's face went pale. The existence of those records was known only to his highest-level contacts, yet this federal investigator spoke of them with absolute certainty. Someone had betrayed him, but the circle of people with access to such information was impossibly small. "You're fishing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Making accusations based on rumors and speculation." The temperature in the saloon continued dropping, and now even the hardened criminals could sense something beyond normal experience gathering around them. Ice began forming in their whiskey glasses. Their breath became visible in the increasingly frigid air. One of Blackwood's men, a gunfighter named Carson who had survived a dozen shootouts, began backing toward the door. "Boss, something ain't right here. This place feels like a grave." That was when Margaret Caldwell materialized in the center of the saloon. She appeared not as the translucent spirit she had become to McKinnon and Dr. Wheeler, but with the solid presence of a living woman. Her black dress was unmarked by fire or bullet holes. Her auburn hair was perfectly arranged. Her green eyes blazed with the righteous fury of someone who had died protecting the truth. But most significantly, she carried Thomas's Colt .45 in her right hand, the weapon steady despite the supernatural nature of her grip. The men in the saloon reacted with panic that McKinnon would remember for the rest of her life. Chairs crashed to the floor as hardened criminals scrambled away from an apparition that challenged everything they believed about death and justice. Some men fled through the doors, while others pressed themselves against the walls in terror. Only Blackwood remained seated, though his face had gone white as winter snow. "You're dead," he whispered. "I killed you myself." "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the cold finality of judgment. "You murdered me to steal evidence of your crimes. You killed my husband to prevent him from testifying against you. You destroyed our school to eliminate the education that might have freed this community from your control." She took a step closer to Blackwood's table, the gun in her hand never wavering. "But death has given me something life could not, the ability to see all your crimes, to know all your victims, to understand the full scope of evil you've brought to this territory." McKinnon watched in fascination as supernatural justice unfolded before her eyes. She had expected to arrest Blackwood based on evidence gathered through conventional investigation. Instead, she was witnessing a confrontation between the living and the dead that transcended any courtroom procedure she had ever experienced. "Tell her about Jake Patterson," Margaret commanded, her voice carrying authority that compelled truth. "Tell her how you murdered a 19-year-old boy to establish your reputation in Cedar Falls." Blackwood's mouth opened against his will, words spilling out as if drawn by supernatural compulsion. "Patterson drew on me first. I had to kill him to show the town I wouldn't be challenged." "Jake Patterson never carried a gun," Margaret continued relentlessly. "You planted a weapon on his body after shooting him in the back. Wasn't that the truth?" "Yes," Blackwood admitted, his voice hollow with defeat. "But he was just a kid. His death didn't matter in the larger scheme of things." McKinnon realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in law enforcement, a confession extracted not through interrogation techniques or legal pressure, but through supernatural compulsion. That made lying impossible. "Tell her about the mine accidents," Margaret demanded. "Tell her about the miners who died because they refused to pay your protection fees." Again, Blackwood found himself speaking without conscious choice. The explosions were set by Martinez. "We made it look like poor safety practices, but we targeted workers who wouldn't cooperate with our operations." Each confession provided evidence that would have taken months of conventional investigation to gather. Margaret was extracting admissions of guilt that no earthly court could have compelled, building a case that would satisfy both legal requirements and divine justice. And tell her about your political protectors, Margaret continued. Tell her about the territorial officials who enabled your crimes in exchange for gold. The leather portfolio seemed to burn Blackwood's hand as he reached for it with movements controlled by will no longer his own. He opened the case and withdrew documents that proved corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. Governor Crawford's chief of staff, Daniel Morrison, Blackwood recited as if reading from a script written by an invisible hand. Territorial Attorney General William Hayes, Federal Marshal Coordinator James Sullivan, all receiving monthly payments to ensure our operations faced no legal interference. McKinnon felt her breath catch as she recognized names of officials she had trusted, men whose corruption explained why her investigation had faced so many obstacles. The evidence Blackwood was revealing would expose a network of criminal complicity that reached into federal institutions, but Margaret wasn't finished. Around the saloon, other forms began materializing, the ghosts of everyone Blackwood's organization had killed. Jake Patterson appeared beside his killer, his young face showing the bullet wound that had ended his life. The miners who had died in mysterious accidents stood along the walls, their work clothes still bearing traces of the explosions that had claimed them. Most heartbreaking of all, Thomas Caldwell materialized beside his wife, his gentle teachers, hands reaching out to touch the woman he had loved enough to die protecting. Tell her everything, the gathering of spirits demanded in voices that seemed to come from the wind itself. Tell her about every life you've taken, every family you've destroyed, every act of evil you've committed in your pursuit of wealth and power. For the next hour, Blackwood confessed to crimes that spanned 3 territories and included murders, thefts, kidnappings, and corruption on a scale that staggered McKinnon's understanding. The supernatural compulsion prevented him from withholding any detail, from protecting any associate, from maintaining any of the lies that had shielded his organization from justice. His remaining men, those who hadn't fled in terror, found themselves equally compelled to confess their roles in the criminal enterprise. They provided names, dates, locations, and methods that would allow federal authorities to dismantle the entire organization and prosecute everyone involved. As dawnlight began filtering through the saloon windows, the supernatural presences began to fade. Margaret was the last to disappear, but before she vanished completely, she approached McKinnon with an expression of profound gratitude. "Justice has been served," Margaret said softly. "The evidence you need is here. The confessions have been given, and the truth has been spoken. The dead can rest now, knowing that the living will ensure these crimes are properly punished." McKinnon found herself alone in the Silver Dollar with Blackwood and his associates, all of whom sat in stunned silence as the full implications of their supernatural confessions settled upon them. The leather portfolio lay open on the table, its contents providing physical evidence to support every admission they had made. "Garrett Blackwood," McKinnon said formally, "you are under arrest for multiple murders, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and corruption of territorial officials. You have confessed to these crimes in the presence of witnesses, and that confession will be used against you in federal court." As she placed handcuffs on the man who had terrorized Cedar Falls, McKinnon understood that she had participated in something unprecedented in the history of law enforcement. Justice had been served through means that no legal textbook described, but the results would satisfy the most demanding federal prosecutor. The dead had indeed ensured that truth prevailed over political protection. That evidence survived attempts at destruction, and that justice transcended the limitations of earthly courts. Margaret Caldwell had kept her promise, and Cedar Falls was finally free. The telegraph lines that had been severed to isolate Cedar Falls mysteriously repaired themselves overnight. Federal communications resumed at dawn, carrying news that would shake the territorial government to its foundations and expose corruption that reached from frontier saloons to the marble halls of federal buildings in Denver. McKinnon's first Telegram to federal headquarters included a simple but explosive message. Blackwood organization dismantled. Full confessions obtained. Territorial corruption confirmed at highest levels. Request immediate federal intervention for mass arrests. The response came within hours. Signed by Federal Marshal Commander Robert Sterling himself. Federal task force dispatched. Maintain custody of prisoners. Preserve all evidence. Extraordinary work, Investigator McKinnon. But preserving the evidence presented unique challenges. How could McKinnon explain in federal court that crucial confessions had been obtained through supernatural compulsion? How could prosecutors present testimony extracted by ghostly intervention without undermining their entire case? The answer came from an unexpected source: the criminals themselves, who seemed unable to recant the confessions they had made in the silver dollar. Blackwood, when questioned again in the cold light of morning, repeated every detail of his admissions with the same compulsive honesty that had characterized his supernatural interrogation. "I can't lie about it," he told McKinnon, with obvious frustration during a formal interview. "Every time I try to deny what I said last night, the words stick in my throat. It's as if something is preventing me from taking back the truth." His associates reported the same phenomenon. They could discuss other topics normally, but any attempt to retract their confessions resulted in an inability to speak. Margaret's supernatural intervention had apparently created a permanent compulsion toward truthfulness regarding their crimes. Dr. Wheeler, serving as the territorial coroner, provided medical documentation that would support the supernatural elements of the case without requiring courts to acknowledge ghostly testimony. His examination of the silver dollar revealed physical evidence that no conventional explanation could account for. "The temperature differential cannot be explained by natural causes," Wheeler wrote in his official report. "Ice formation occurred in a warm room with no source of refrigeration. Multiple witnesses confirm atmospheric disturbances consistent with." He paused in his writing, understanding that his next words would determine whether his medical career survived this case. "Consistent with unexplained meteorological phenomena," he concluded, providing scientific language that avoided supernatural explanations while acknowledging that something beyond normal experience had occurred. McKinnon appreciated Wheeler's diplomatic phrasing. Federal courts required evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny, but they also recognized that frontier conditions sometimes produced circumstances that defied conventional explanation. The key was presenting supernatural events in terms that allowed judges to render verdicts without officially acknowledging the existence of ghosts. Meanwhile, the broader implications of Blackwood's confessions were creating political earthquakes throughout the territorial administration. Governor Crawford's chief of staff, Daniel Morrison, was arrested at his Denver office as federal marshals, moved swiftly to prevent the destruction of evidence or the flight of conspirators. Territorial Attorney General William Hayes, ironically sharing a surname with the marshal who had died protecting Cedar Falls, was taken into custody while attempting to board a train to California. The financial records from Blackwood's portfolio provided documentation of every payment, every favor, and every instance of legal protection purchased through criminal gold. Most shocking of all was the arrest of Federal Marshal Coordinator James Sullivan, whose position had allowed him to suppress investigations and reassign honest federal officers who threatened criminal operations. His corruption explained how Blackwood's organization had operated with such impunity across territorial boundaries. The political ramifications extended beyond individual arrests. President Chester A. Arthur himself ordered a comprehensive investigation into territorial administration, resulting in the suspension of Governor Crawford and the appointment of a federal oversight committee to ensure honest governance. But the most profound changes occurred in Cedar Falls itself, where the supernatural events had transformed not just the balance of power, but the entire community's understanding of justice and moral responsibility. young Billy Patterson, whose psychic sensitivity had first revealed Margaret's ghostly presence, reported that the supernatural activity had ended completely. "She's gone," he told his parents with the matter-of-fact certainty that had characterized all his visions. "Mrs. Caldwell isn't here anymore. She finished what she needed to do." The cemetery where Thomas and Margaret were buried became a place of pilgrimage for residents who understood that something miraculous had occurred in their community. Fresh flowers appeared daily on the graves, left by people who had never fully appreciated the teacher's dedication until after their deaths. More significantly, the community began organizing to ensure that the educational legacy Thomas and Margaret had died defending would continue. Local merchants pooled resources to rebuild the schoolhouse, while miners contributed labor to construct a building that exceeded the original academy plans that Caldwell's had dreamed of creating. Mrs. Patterson, Jake's mother, emerged as an unexpected leader in this effort. Her son's murder had marked the beginning of Blackwood's reign of terror, but his killer's conviction allowed her to channel grief into constructive action. "Those teachers died protecting something precious," she told the community meeting organized to plan the new school. "We honor their sacrifice by ensuring that education in Cedar Falls becomes everything they hoped it could be." The federal government, embarrassed by the extent of corruption revealed through Blackwood's confessions, provided substantial funding for the educational project. The new Cedar Falls Academy would serve as a model institution, demonstrating federal commitment to honest territorial development. Dr. Wheeler found himself appointed as interim territorial administrator for educational affairs, his role in exposing the criminal organization having earned him respect in federal circles. His first act was to recruit teachers whose qualifications and dedication matched those of the martyred Caldwells. Among the new arrivals was Professor Elizabeth Manning, a graduate of Oberlin College whose advanced degrees in literature and mathematics brought exactly the kind of educational expertise Thomas and Margaret had envisioned for their academy. More importantly, Manning possessed the moral courage that frontier education required, having previously taught in Kansas during the violent conflicts over slavery. "I've heard the story of what happened here," Manning told Dr. Wheeler during her interview. "I want to be part of ensuring that their sacrifice leads to something lasting and meaningful." The trials of Blackwood and his conspirators became the most closely watched legal proceedings in territorial history. Federal prosecutors, armed with confessions that couldn't be retracted and evidence that documented crimes across multiple jurisdictions, built cases that would set precedents for territorial law enforcement. Blackwood himself faced charges that carried the death penalty, multiple murders, conspiracy against federal authority, and treason for his role in corrupting territorial government. His supernatural compulsion to tell the truth made him an ineffective witness for his own defense. The defendant appears unable to lie about his criminal activities, observed Federal Judge Harrison during preliminary hearings. "This court has never encountered a case where a defendant's testimony so thoroughly supported the prosecution's charges." Defense attorneys struggled to build cases for clients who couldn't deny their guilt. The best they could achieve were plea agreements that exchanged cooperation for reduced sentences, further expanding the federal investigation into territorial corruption. But the trials also revealed the human cost of the criminal organization's activities. Families testified about loved ones who had died in mysterious accidents. Merchants described years of paying protection money while living in fear. Women spoke of harassment and violence they had endured in silence. Margaret's supernatural intervention had not only exposed criminal activity, but also provided a forum for victims who had never before felt safe enough to seek justice. The federal trials became a process of community healing that allowed Cedar Falls to confront the trauma Blackwood's organization had inflicted. McKinnon found herself transformed by the experience of working with supernatural forces to achieve justice. Her official reports carefully avoided explicit references to ghostly assistance, but her reputation as an investigator who could solve impossible cases grew throughout federal law enforcement circles. There are aspects of frontier justice that cannot be explained through conventional methods, she wrote in her confidential briefing to federal headquarters. Investigators must remain open to sources of information and evidence that transcend standard procedural expectations. Her superiors, pragmatic men who valued results over explanations, promoted her to chief federal investigator for territorial affairs. Her first assignment was to apply lessons learned in Cedar Falls to other territories where corruption and criminal activity had proven resistant to conventional law enforcement. But McKinnon carried with her more than professional advancement. Her encounter with Margaret Caldwell had provided personal proof that justice could transcend death, that moral courage could overcome any obstacle, and that truth would ultimately prevail regardless of the power arrayed against it. She established a practice of visiting the graves of crime victims in every case she investigated, not from superstition but from respect for the understanding that justice served the dead as well as the living. The dead deserved to have their stories told, their murders solved, and their killers brought to account. Meanwhile, the federal investigation sparked by Blackwood's confessions continued expanding. His organization had operated in 12 territories. Corrupting officials and eliminating opposition wherever valuable resources attracted criminal attention. Each territory faced the same reckoning that had transformed Colorado, as federal task forces armed with evidence from Cedar Falls moved systematically to dismantle criminal networks and prosecute corrupt officials. The supernatural events in the Silver Dollar Saloon had triggered the largest federal anti-corruption effort in territorial history. But for the residents of Cedar Falls, the most meaningful change was simpler and more personal. They could walk their streets without fear, conduct business without paying tribute to criminals, and plan for futures that didn't depend on the whims of violent men. The new schoolhouse rose where the old one had burned, its bell tower visible from every corner of the valley. When classes resumed in the fall, enrollment included children from every family in Cedar Falls, a testament to the community's renewed faith in education and its commitment to honoring the sacrifice of 2 teachers who had died defending that faith. On the first day of school, Professor Manning rang the bell that would call students to learning, its clear tone echoing off the mountains where Thomas and Margaret Caldwell had found love, purpose, and ultimately, the courage to die for principles that would outlive their mortal lives. The sound carried across the valley like a promise that justice, once achieved, would not be forgotten, and that sacrifice in service of truth would bear fruit in generations yet to come. 5 years after the night when the dead claimed justice from the living, Cedar Falls had transformed into something that would have amazed Thomas and Margaret Caldwell. The Cedar Falls Academy stood as the finest educational institution in 3 territories, its graduates sought after by universities as far away as Harvard and Yale. The town had become a symbol of what frontier communities could achieve when corruption was eliminated and honest progress was allowed to flourish. Professor Elizabeth Manning stood in the Academy's main classroom, watching her students work through advanced mathematics problems that would have challenged college freshmen in eastern cities. These children, sons and daughters of miners, farmers, and merchants, were receiving education that rivaled anything available in established states. But the most remarkable student was Billy Patterson, now 15 years old and preparing for university entrance examinations. His psychic sensitivity, which had first revealed Margaret's supernatural presence, had evolved into an extraordinary intellectual capacity that amazed every teacher who worked with him. "Billy," Professor Manning said after class had dismissed, "I've received responses to your university applications. Harvard, Yale, and Columbia have all accepted you with full scholarships." Billy's smile carried the quiet satisfaction of someone whose unusual gifts had found proper channels. "Mrs. Caldwell told me this would happen," he said matter-of-factly. "She said education would be my way of honoring what she and Mr. Caldwell died for." Manning had learned not to question Billy's continued connection to the supernatural realm. Over the years, his occasional conversations with the deceased teachers had provided guidance that invariably proved correct and beneficial. "Does she still visit you?" Manning asked gently. "Not the way she used to," Billy replied thoughtfully. "More like distant conversations. She's at peace now, but she still cares about what happens here. She and Mr. Caldwell are proud of what the Academy has become." Federal investigator Sarah McKinnon, now Chief of Territorial Law Enforcement, arrived in Cedar Falls that afternoon for the annual memorial service that honored Thomas and Margaret Caldwell. Her presence had become a tradition, marking both her professional debt to the supernatural investigation that had launched her career, and her personal commitment to ensuring their sacrifice was never forgotten. The memorial service took place in the Academy's Assembly Hall, where portraits of the martyred teachers hung beside the American flag and the territorial seal. The entire community gathered for the event, including many faces that hadn't been present 5 years earlier. Chinese families who had found acceptance in the reformed Cedar Falls sat beside Polish miners and Irish railroad workers. The community that Thomas and Margaret had envisioned diverse, educated, and united by shared values had finally come to reality. Dr. Wheeler, now Territorial Supervisor of Education, delivered the annual address commemorating their sacrifice. But this year's speech carried special significance, as he was announcing his retirement and the appointment of his successor. The Cedar Falls Academy will be led by someone who embodies the same principles that Thomas and Margaret Caldwell died defending, Wheeler announced. Professor Manning has agreed to serve as our new superintendent, ensuring that their educational vision continues to guide this institution. The applause that followed was interrupted by an unexpected presence that only Billy Patterson and a few other sensitive individuals could perceive. Margaret Caldwell appeared briefly in the back of the assembly hall, her translucent form visible for just a moment. To those with the gift to see beyond the physical world, she was not alone. Thomas stood beside her, along with the spirits of every person whose death had been avenged through their supernatural intervention. They had come to witness the celebration of what their sacrifice had made possible. Billy felt tears in his eyes as he sensed their presence. The dead had found peace, but they continued to care about the living world they had helped to transform. Their love for education, for justice, and for the community they had served transcended death itself. After the ceremony, McKinnon visited the cemetery where the Caldwells were buried. Their graves were marked now by a magnificent monument erected by federal funds, acknowledging their service to territorial justice. Fresh flowers appeared daily, left by people whose lives had been touched by their story. "Thank you," McKinnon said quietly to the headstones, "for showing me that justice takes many forms, that courage can overcome any obstacle, and that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the cost." She wasn't surprised when she felt a presence responding to her words, not visible, but unmistakably real. Margaret's spirit touched her consciousness with gratitude and approval, acknowledging the federal investigator who had trusted supernatural guidance when conventional methods had failed. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young couple, David Chun, son of the Chinese family that had fled Cedar Falls during Blackwood's reign of terror, and Mary O'Brien, daughter of the Irish mining family that had arrived seeking honest work. They carried flowers for the graves and news that would have delighted the living teachers. "We're engaged," Mary announced with joy. "And we wanted to tell them first, since our families found acceptance here because of what they sacrificed for." David nodded solemnly. "Our children will attend the academy they died to protect. They'll learn about the courage it takes to stand for what's right, even when the cost seems too high to bear." McKinnon felt a profound sense of completion, watching this young couple plan their future in the community that supernatural justice had transformed. Love was growing where violence had once reigned. Education was flourishing where ignorance had been enforced. Hope was building where fear had been cultivated. As evening approached, McKinnon made her way to the Silver Dollar Saloon, which had been converted into a community meeting hall after Blackwood's arrest. The building where supernatural justice had been delivered now served as a place where citizens gathered to discuss municipal improvements and plan community projects. The irony wasn't lost on her. The location where a criminal organization had conducted its evil business had become the heart of democratic participation in Cedar Falls. Justice had not only punished the guilty, but had transformed their instruments of oppression into tools of community empowerment. Inside the former saloon, she found a gathering that would have been impossible during Blackwood's reign. Miners, farmers, merchants, and professional people working together to plan the expansion of the academy to include technical training that would benefit the entire territory. "We're proposing a mining engineering program," explained James Patterson, Billy's father, who had emerged as a community leader after his son's miraculous escape from Blackwood's violence. "Safe, scientific methods that will prevent the kind of accidents that used to kill workers regularly." The proposal was part of a larger vision that reflected the educational philosophy Thomas and Margaret had promoted. Knowledge should serve practical needs while elevating human dignity. Technical training would provide economic opportunities, but it would be grounded in scientific understanding and ethical principles. McKinnon listened to the discussion with satisfaction, understanding that she was witnessing the long-term fruits of supernatural intervention. The dead had not merely punished criminals, they had planted seeds of positive change that continued growing years after their earthly mission was complete. Later that evening, alone in her hotel room, McKinnon wrote her final report on the Cedar Falls case. It would be archived in federal files, a record of events that had transformed territorial law enforcement and demonstrated the possibility of justice that transcended conventional limitations. "The supernatural elements of this investigation cannot be verified through standard evidentiary procedures," she wrote carefully. "However, the results achieved through unconventional methods justify the conclusion that justice takes forms that extend beyond current legal understanding." She paused in her writing, remembering Margaret's final appearance in the Silver Dollar Saloon 5 years earlier. The schoolteacher's spirit had radiated peace and satisfaction, knowing that truth had been spoken and justice had been achieved. "In cases where conventional law enforcement fails," McKinnon continued, "investigators must remain open to assistance from sources that cannot be explained, but should not be dismissed. The dead deserve justice as much as the living, and sometimes they find ways to claim it." Her final words carried the weight of professional experience and personal conviction. The Cedar Falls case proves that moral courage can overcome any obstacle, that truth will ultimately prevail over deception, and that justice, once claimed, creates changes that endure long after the immediate battle is won. As McKinnon sealed the report, she felt a familiar presence in the room, gentle, grateful, and eternally peaceful. Margaret Caldwell was saying goodbye, not just to the federal investigator who had helped bring earthly justice to her killers, but to the world of the living that she had served so faithfully in life and death. The presence faded, leaving McKinnon with absolute certainty that Margaret and Thomas had found their eternal rest. Their work was complete. Justice had been served. Their educational legacy was secure. Their love would continue inspiring others through the academy they had died to protect. Outside her window, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled in the mountain darkness, homes where families lived without fear, businesses that operated without paying tribute to criminals, and a school where children learned that education was worth any sacrifice necessary to preserve it. The academy bell tower, visible even in the darkness, stood as a monument to the truth that some values transcend death itself. When morning came, its bell would ring again, calling students to learning, teachers to service, and a community to the continued pursuit of justice and knowledge. In the cemetery on the hill, fresh flowers would appear on 2 graves that marked the resting place of heroes whose courage had transformed fear into hope, whose love had conquered hatred, and whose sacrifice had proven that death itself could not defeat truth. Margaret Caldwell had walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon with her dead husband's gun and asked which coward had killed her love. She had received her answer, claimed her justice, and built a legacy that would inspire generations of students, teachers, and citizens who understood that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the cost. The dead had found peace, the living had found justice, and Cedar Falls had found its soul. In the end, love had indeed proven stronger than death, truth more powerful than deception, and justice more enduring than the criminals who had thought themselves beyond its reach. The story was complete, but its lessons would live forever in the hearts of all who heard it and understood that courage, once kindled, creates light that no darkness can extinguish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.